What's up? This week we're going to talk about the brain, which is the coolest organ in the human body. So what we're going to do this week is be able to identify the major parts of the human brain from a model. I'm going to give you a hat to make, and you're going to wear the hat, and you should be able to point at the various regions of the brain and tell me what their functions are by the end of this lesson. Fingers crossed. So the brain is the most complicated organ in the human body, and it's the least understood. So the information that we're going to get here is pretty general. The brain is not very heavy. It weighs about 7 or 8 pounds, and it contains billions of neurons, which are brain cells, and those neurons have connections between them. It's the most complicated computing machine that there is in all of existence. If you were to take all of the computers on Earth and combine them together, you would have nowhere near the computing power that your brain contains. Let's start out with the forebrain, which is the newest part of the brain, the most recently evolved part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that makes humans special. Our forebrain is more highly developed than any other organism on Earth, which is pretty incredible. We have more computing power per square inch in our forebrain than any other animal on the planet Earth. Pretty cool. So the forebrain contains the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. There is a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. The left hemisphere for most people is your dominant hemisphere. Anything that happens in the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, which explains why most people are right-handed. They are left-brained. The right hemisphere is responsible for the left side of your body. The left hemisphere is usually given credit for things like language, logical reasoning, problem solving, and ability to think mathematically. This is the logical side of the brain. The right hemisphere is usually credited with artistic ability, spatial reasoning, and creativity. So if you're an artist, maybe you're right-brained, and if you're more of a mathematician, then maybe you're a left-brained person. Let's start with the lobes of the cortex. We're going to start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is located here. These are the frontal lobes of your brain. They are mainly in control of your motor functions. The frontal lobe of your brain is probably one of the most important regions of your brain in terms of human ability. So your frontal lobe is where all of your higher thinking happens. When you think of what your conscious is telling you what to do, it's probably happening in here. So the frontal lobe is in control of your judgment, right? So if your frontal lobe is damaged, then your ability to make decisions might be affected as well. Problem solving, reasoning, abstract thought, they all happen here. These are things that human beings are usually credited with having that makes us unique. Your frontal lobe is the better angel on your shoulder, if you will. One of the most important things that the frontal lobe does is language. Your ability to speak to other humans and comprehend what they're saying is processed and done in the frontal lobe. There's this area of the brain called Broca's area or Broca's region that is responsible for the motor function of speech. So it controls your tongue and your lips and the regions of your mouth that you use to talk. What's interesting is we can look at the skulls of humans and human ancestors and see that region of the skull that is opened up for Broca's area, and we can measure the size. This can help us get an idea of how human evolution worked in terms of developing language. Broca's area is much larger. Mr. Benson.
Hey, Mr. Benson, it's Dave Stalin. Just a quick question. I'm looking at the...
So one of the most important things that the frontal lobe does is it controls the motor function of your speaking ability. This is something that no other animal can do, is speak with the complexity that we have. And this happens in the frontal lobe. In fact, we can learn about human evolution by looking at the area of the brain. It's called Broca's area that does the motor production of speech, we can look at that part of the brain in hominids and pre-human ancestors, and we can compare that region of the skulls, at least, that are opened up for that part of the brain to our own, and see if that space has gotten larger or smaller over time. And it turns out that Broca's area gets bigger as we approach modern humans. So speech seems to be something that is evolving in humans to become more complex, more complicated, more able to communicate ideas like what's happening right now. Next up is the parietal lobe of the brain, which is just behind the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is in charge of some of the spatial recognition that you have, some of the spatial orientation, the ability for your body to recognize where your limbs are. That's a sense that you have. In addition to sight and sound and smell and touch and taste, there's also a sense of location in terms of your limbs. Where are they in relationship to your body? Next up are the temporal lobes of the brain, which are just behind your ears. So it might be pretty obvious, but the area of your brain that's near your ears is responsible for processing auditory information. So sounds are processed in this portion of the brain, along with higher order visual information that you have to process goes through the temporal lobe. A lot of aspects of your memory are also happening in the temporal lobe. Next up are the occipital lobes, which are the rearmost portion of your cortex. They process visual information. So funny enough, the part of your brain that processes the information going into your eyes is actually furthest from your eye, at the back of your head. Boxers that are hit in the back of the head, they might temporarily go blind because of damage to the occipital lobes. That's why in boxing, for instance, and MMA, strikes to the back of the head are illegal. There's also a part of your brain here called the Corpus Callosum that connects the two halves of your brain. This is strange, and I'll show you a video later. You can live perfectly normally with one half of your brain. You don't need an entire brain to have a normal human life. The thing that connects these two super powerful computers together is the corpus callosum. Okay, next up we're going to talk about an older part of your brain that you have in common with lots of other groups of animals, reptiles, birds, amphibians. These animals all have the hindbrain, and your hindbrain is developed, but it's not super developed. This is the ancient part of your brain. The hindbrain that we're going to focus on, the parts of it are the cerebellum, which will control things like equilibrium, which is your ability to balance, how your posture is, fine movement and coordination in your hands and feet and your muscles individually. Those are all controlled by the cerebellum. The pons is sort of a communication relay between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So the forebrain and the hindbrain use the pons to communicate with each other. Next up, we're going to look at the medulla oblongata, which is, again, a part of the ancient part of your brain. The medulla controls conscious movement in your body, in particular the movement of skeletal muscles. So large movements in your body would be controlled by the medulla oblongata. There are things that are involuntary that are controlled by the medulla. Things like your heart beating. You never have to think about your heart beating. Breathing, when you're not thinking about it at least, is controlled by the medulla oblongata. Swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, all of these things that you don't have any real physical control over happen because the medulla is making them happen. So that's it for the brain this week. Not a very complicated topic, even though it is the most complicated topic that there is in biology. I'll show you some examples of damage to each of these parts of the brain so that we can get a better idea of what their function is, because the brain is really one of the most interesting things that we can learn about in biology because it's so mysterious. That's it for this week, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, push the thing, and you know what? Just push the buttons. See you next week.